we are going to talk about the Gaza ceasefire and the 4 Israeli hostages freed by Hamas in swap for 200 Palestinian prisoners. Now, these aren't 4 Israeli hostages. These are 4 Israeli prisoners of war. These are 4 Israeli soldiers. Make no mistake, Channel 4, albeit is one of the best Western outlets out there in terms of communicating exactly what's going on in Gaza to the best of their ability, okay? And yet there's still a bar there. While they clear that low bar, it's still far from the appropriate way of talking about these issues. It's something you should understand. And the reason why it is especially important to recognize in this situation is because in order to combat that narrative, Hamas this time around made them wear their IDF garb in their release. Now, remember, for the past 16 months, Israel has propagandized about both the understandable, the devastation of October 7 and the subsequent propaganda that consistently claimed, without any evidence whatsoever, mind you, that these Palestinians are all barbaric rapist monsters and that they had no political motivations and no interest in emancipation whatsoever in any of their actions, but simply are operating on anti-Semitic tendencies and did this because they despise Jewish people and want to rape them, right? They kidnapped people not because they wanted a political bargaining chip, a leverage over the sovereign occupying nation that has dominated their existence with no means of emancipation whatsoever, no way out of this horrifying process whatsoever in a concentration camp that is also known as Gaza, the world's largest open-air prison, but instead for selfish, violent desires. This initiative, the way that this release happened from Hamas's designs here, was to combat that misinformation, to showcase that, one, to the best of their limited abilities under a ruthless and brutal blockade and consistent bombing, that international organs of justice and humanitarian groups, including Israeli humanitarian groups, have called a genocide, militants tasked with Palestinian emancipation and the resistance against the Israeli apartheid and Israeli genocide, were able to successfully secure the well-being to the best of their abilities of the prisoners that they had taken. This completely undermines the Israeli narrative. If you recall, there was a lot of back and forth in Israeli media talking about how these girls are being raped every day. They're pregnant. They fear for the worst. There was no evidence for this whatsoever. Not to say that this would never happen, right? I'm not saying that at all. As I've maintained throughout my coverage of October 7, and as I've talked about consistently, even in other instances, sexual violence and sexual assault is all too common in the field of battle. It happens all the time. So there is a likelihood that it could have happened here as well. And yet there was no evidence to suggest that it had happened to these hostages. But at the time, the colonizers' imagination was the only evidence necessary. I-24 said Israel prepares for female hostages in Gaza to return pregnant. Report, Israel permits abortion up to the moment of birth. Medical professionals stress the mental toll of conceiving through rape in captivity. More than 9 months, Hostage Family Forum publishes videos implying pregnant hostages. The video depicts a tunnel, which cuts to a video of a pregnant woman and the sound of a baby crying. And yet when they were released, unlike the horrifying conditions of the Palestinians that were falsely detained by the Israeli apartheid regime, in spite of the fact that they literally were also side by side with Palestinians experiencing the ruthless Israeli bombing campaigns, they came across far healthier than the Palestinian prisoners that are released on a daily basis.
If all goes well, the end of this nightmare is in sight. Hamas fighters walking the 4 young Israeli soldiers they've held for 477 days since the awful events of October 7th to a podium in Gaza City.
New conspiracy: they gave birth and the babies are hostage now? I have a horrible theory. What if they were impregnated, gave birth, and now released without their babies? And now Hamas is blackmailing and using those babies to keep them from telling the world what happened. It's not out of the realm of possibility for these sick animals. 420 likes. I would treat those babies like the devil's spawn. But 1, they're Jewish. 2, aren't babies innocent and have no say in how they're born into this world? They're not Jewish. They're the seed of devil subhumans. It's interesting to see in real time how a population that has been completely captive to fascist propaganda that spawned over almost an entire century reacts to situations like this. One day, if the world has not completely fallen to authoritarian fascism, historians will look back at these moments and document and will greatly elevate the field of fascist scholarship surrounding and historical research surrounding how a captive population receives fascist doctrine and how it changes their collective psyche. This is the fantasies of an insane person, and it's happening in real time, and it's very consequential. The very fact that people don't immediately go, this is the most insane thing I've ever heard in my entire life, you are out of your mind, and instead people go, you know what, you're probably saying a very scary truth right now, is damning for anyone with any critical thinking skills. It's devastating. But that is the reason why they did this release, this show of force, this show to basically say, look, the conditions that you claim that these hostages were in is not the conditions that they were actually in. And all matter of death and devastation that they experienced came in the hands of Israeli bombing campaigns. Now, this has been a consistent thing that we have heard from Israeli hostages that have been released. From the first hostage release that took place on humanitarian grounds, I think her name was Lipschitz, the old lady, all the way to even the likes of Noah Argani, who was a very famous Israeli captive that was taken from the Nova Festival, if you recall. Most Israeli hostages and prisoners of war have repeatedly said the exact same things, that the real fear that they experienced was the bombs falling on them indiscriminately. And even Israeli news has reported this, in spite of the obvious restrictions placed upon Israeli media from its fascist government. I fear, and I say this with sincerity, I fear this has happened throughout history under very similar circumstances, as a matter of fact. If you recall, the entire concept of the Manchurian Candidate, going all the way back to the Korean War for a brief moment, is born out of a very similar perspective. The American government, the American State Department, alongside American interests in the region, consistently dehumanized both the Koreans and the Chinese. And because of that, when when American soldiers were held captive by the Koreans or the Chinese, they were not mistreated, yet the media kept saying that they were. So when they actually came back and reported on their actual experiences, while we were supposed to maintain the position that these are some of the most fucked over people, right? They were held captive by the enemy because they did not play along with American propaganda. We assumed that they were brainwashed. We assumed that they had actually fallen to communist brainwashing. The term brainwashing literally comes from this. It was first utilized by American media to explain the process of how soldiers being held by Korean and Chinese communists did not have negative opinions about them, and more so started talking about imperialism in certain instances. That's where the term brainwashing comes from. Something that is in, our colloquial, it's in common lexicon at this point. Something that you just don't even think about. That's where it literally comes from. Isn't that crazy? The idea that the treatment, the expectation was that our enemy will treat our soldiers in an inhumane way. Pure projection. And when the reality doesn't match the expectations and the lies, we turn around and we say, well, there's something more nefarious afoot. This was the testimony of Noah Argamani, a freed Israeli hostage that was featured widely in Israeli media that claimed she was beaten and abused while in captivity. An hour ago, she posted a clarification on her Instagram story saying the Israeli media basically lied about it at all. Here is her own words. I can't ignore what has been going on in the media here in the last 24 hours. Things are out of context. They didn't beat me and didn't cut my hair. I was in a building that was blown up by the Air Force. The exact quote is, this weekend after my shooting, as I said, I had cuts all over my head and hit my whole body. I emphasize, they didn't hit me, but I was hurt all over my body from the collapse of the structure on me. As a victim of the 7th of October, I will not allow myself to be a victim again by the media. And what's additionally shocking about this is that these are people who live in Israel. These are people who are also susceptible to the same propaganda cycles when they, grew up with this social conditioning. And yet even they are like, dude, that's not the case. Like, you are using my own personal experience and my own personal story, the horrifying conditions that I went through, to lie.
In return, in Ramallah, the West Bank, Israel began releasing Palestinian prisoners, 200 in total, some taken by minibus to Khan Yunis, Gaza.
We thank the Palestinian resistance, specifically Al-Qassam brigades and Al-Quds brigades, and we thank every Palestinian resistance fighter.
But those who'd been convicted of the most violent crimes won't be allowed home, instead deported outside the Palestinian territories, this bus crossing the border to Egypt.
So here's more footage from their release as well. Breaking: Netanyahu says Israel will block Palestinian return to North Gaza until dispute over captive Adbel Yehud is settled. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has issued a statement saying Israel will not allow Palestinians to cross into northern Gaza as agreed upon in the ceasefire deal until the issue of the female civilian captive Adbel Yehud, who Israel expected to be released on Saturday, is resolved. Earlier, Israeli military spokesperson Avichai Adrae wrote on X that Hamas had violated the ceasefire agreement. Hamas released 4 IDF soldiers this morning. 200 Palestinian captives are set to be released shortly, and they have been, I think. Now, here is some information about this as well. Hold on. Seth Harp says strict adherence to the laws of war and dignified treatment of your enemy confers a powerful strategic advantage in the long term. Hamas is constantly outsmarting Israel. See, this is like perhaps the most logical way of looking at it, to a degree where, like, even if you believe that there are some really bad guys in Hamas, and that's an understandable position to have, right? Especially if you're, a American, it is the logical thing to do. It's kind of the same principle that I maintained throughout the past 15, 16 months, where people would come in here and be like, no, they're definitely killing the hostages. And I kept repeating over and over again, there is no logical reason for Hamas to just execute a hostage without showing it on camera. If you recall, I kept saying, if Hamas kills a hostage, if Al-Qassam kills a hostage, if the Palestinian Islamic Jihad kills a hostage, you will know, because they will use that as propaganda. They will, because these hostages are their only form of leverage. These hostages are a bargaining chip. So their welfare, their well-being is of supreme importance. When the enemy is doing a genocide on your people, you have to protect them no matter what. So the notion that these guys actually had kidnapped these people in this incredibly complex, unimaginable military operation that actually yielded a tremendous amount of trauma and horrifying atrocities in the process, make no mistake, right? I'm not an apologist on any of that. That was not done for simple pleasure, okay? You have to be a fucking idiot to assume that. It was not done because they wanted to kidnap Israelis and, like, rape them and kill them for funsies. It was done for a very clear purpose. And this is the issue that I have specifically with foreign policy. Foreign policy in the United States of America is riddled with thought-terminating terms and media cycles. The designation of terrorism, the notion that all of the enemies of America and all of the enemies of America's allies are actually operating with this, like, parasitic hive mind modus operandi, that they don't have any sort of like logical investment or interest in emancipation. They don't have any humanity, right? That they're simply operating on the lines of doing brutality. If that is the method, if that is the way you approach it, and many, because of the way that the media covers this stuff, many in America do approach it like that. It's a war of good versus evil, yada, yada, yada. You are going to always find yourself confused when you see stuff like this. In that confusion, because you're not exercising critical thinking, in that confusion, you're just going to fall further and further into the whims of propaganda. And that's how you arrive at the concept of brainwashing. That's how you arrive at these, like, grand narratives, right? That, like, maybe these people actually did rape them and are holding their babies hostage, and that's why they have to play ball. And it also, weirdly enough, will create resentment in the Israeli population against the prisoners, the hostages that have been released, if they come out and say, no, these guys didn't actually rape us, like, you're insane. Now, I'm not 100% certain about the well-being of these soldiers. I'm not. I don't know, and only time will tell. But from what I've seen from Israeli media so far, is that people are worried about, like, what how the Israeli prisoners of war are carrying themselves thus far because of this sort of footage. No humiliation, dignified in their military uniform. This is how prisoners of war must be treated under international law. On the other hand, civilians, doctors, journalists, women, and children are kidnapped and tortured and raped in Israeli dungeons. Hamas has learned from the past history of the Palestinian resistance. In 1983, PLO had captured an IDF soldier in Lebanon, Hezi Shai, look him up, and he tried to commit suicide because, as he said later, I wanted to screw the Palestinians and deprive them of their bargaining chip, and Arafat had ordered that his captors keep him alive at all costs until he was released in 1985 in exchange for 1,000 Palestinians. Yeah, oh, by the way, this is another part of this. MK Ultra, the program, this is what's so interesting about both American history and the history of empire in general, is that things that we know, right, like the MK Ultra program, which was a failure, it didn't reach its intended goals. I mean, it maybe was successful in some ways, but it was ultimately a failure that like the American government had no way of like brainwashing people and like controlling them. That program literally was created to, as the chatter correctly points out, reverse engineer the Manchurian candidate communist brainwashing. What's really interesting about that process is that not only do we tell lies, right, when the reality on the ground does not match our expectations or the lies that we've told prior, we then believe our own lies. Think about that. These are people who looked at the situation and were like, there is no way that they were actually not mistreated. These American soldiers were not actually mistreated, and they simply are brainwashed, a concept that we made up, that they're actually secretly sleeper cells being activated to undermine American dominance or whatever, and that we should also do the same and reverse engineer how they were brainwashed and figure out a way to do it ourselves. It's interesting. Like it's fascinating when you think about it, where you tell a lie so much that you yourself believe it, and then decide that you also will spend money and effort to try to create your own version of it. When the alternative is simple, which is, I don't know, take the truth at face value, investigate thoroughly. Nope, can't do that. Can't do that. God forbid we do that. We can't do that. Yeah, it would be akin to the Republicans trying to build a weather machine to control the weather after consistently claiming that like there's a Chinese weather machine. And then they try to like build their own version of it, you know, instead of addressing climate change, which now that you said it, now that I'm thinking about it, is probably something that we are going to do. I can't wait for Pete Hegseth to oversee this operation. Pete Hegseth's like, listen, we have to make our own Jewish Chinese weather machines. And as the Secretary of Defense, I'm going to be working tirelessly around the clock to make our own. We're tasking some of our top Jewish and Chinese scientists to make a Jewish Chinese weather machine ourselves. It cannot be only in the hands of the CCP. The American government must have this technological advancement. For the military and intelligence communities, mind control hovered between myth and science. Nowhere is this more obvious than the peculiar case of an anonymously published 1955 pamphlet called Brainwashing, a synthesis of the Russian textbook on psychopolitics, which purported to be a translation of a work by the Soviet secret police chief Lavrentiy Beria, full of wild claims about how the Soviets used psychology and drugs to control the masses. The pamphlet has a peculiar section devoted to the ways that Dianetics, a pseudoscience invented by the founder of Scientology, L. Ron Hubbard, could prevent brainwashing. As a result, it is widely believed that Hubbard himself wrote the pamphlet as black propaganda, or propaganda that masquerades as something produced by a foreign adversary. The defecting MK Ultra was trying to stop. Yeah, this is it. This is what MK Ultra tried to stop. I wonder if Israel has their own version of this too.
You will be brainwashed. Me, America's son. Ha! That will be a challenge. You bet. Our enemies are all those in league with imperialism. The bureaucrats, the big landlord class, and the reactionary section of the intelligentsia attached to them.
I love this. There's more video that came out. Here is the Al-Qassam, the Israeli hostages that were released also were speaking Arabic.
السلام عليكم مرحبا شكرا لكتاب القسام على كل المعاملة الكويسة.
Once again, this is propaganda for the record. Like, I make no mistake. This is absolutely propaganda. It's also kind of wild how high quality it is. It's like shocking that in spite of the genocide and blockade and all things considered, like they still are. I mean, this is like, they're shooting better than I can. They got road mics. They got the TikTok road mics, bro. That's crazy.
شكرا لشباب اللي كانوا يحفزوا علينا ودير باله علينا من كاسف وإن شاء الله يكون الكل يوم سعيد
She said, Inshallah, like Allah willing, it will be a happy day,
وأحسن يوم
the best day, and we will all be well.
كلنا نكون بخير
يوم 25/1/25.
They have better lighting? Yeah. Just so you understand, out of these 4 Israeli soldiers that were released, I suspect that, you know, they're not all going to have the same opinions, and I'm not certain that they will maintain the position that they were like they might not echo the same sentiment that other Israeli hostages and Israeli prisoners of war have echoed and have delivered, right? I'm not saying that at all. Only time will tell, right? So we shall see what happens in that process. But even in the interim, as far as we can see, the notion that they were impregnated, it does not seem to be correct. Here's drop site news. Oh, this is the full video for the prisoner exchange video. All 4 Israeli hostages are now reunited with their families. This is a wonderful day, by the way, for the record. This is a great thing. Oh, they also give them certificates too. They give them keychains, Al-Qassam keychains. And yeah, certificates. What is happening, dude? They give him, so I saw these gift bags before, like they give him goodie bags.
السلام عليكم مرحبا شكرا
So we saw this part already. So obviously, every act of existence from the Palestinian side is a form of resistance, as we've talked about quite extensively. But the very fact that these Palestinian militant groups are still capable of operating in Gaza in broad daylight in this way is 100% perhaps the most devastating counter message to everything that Israel has communicated to Israeli society thus far. No surprise about the presence of so many Hamas fighters. Oh yeah, no, yeah, Hamas has recruited 10,000 to 15,000 members since the war with Israel began, according to U.S. intelligence brief to Congress. A similar number of fighters have been killed in the same period. Yeah. Oh man, who could have seen this coming, dude? How shocking that this thing that happens every single time an occupying force dominates an entire region and destroys them, it leads to the resistance growing. This is the least shocking event of all time. But yeah, the key points that are being made in these sorts of videos and in general is like, one, the Israeli hostages were, due to their, leverage, due to them being the only existing form of leverage that Hamas and the Palestinian resistance coalition forces had over the apartheid state that was conducting a genocide, due to them being the only leverage point, they were not mistreated to the best of their ability. And not only that, but also that they're still in operation.
Hamas failed to meet its obligations to first release Israeli female civilian hostages as part of the agreement.
Whatever the cause of the delay, hugs for the children they feared they'd never see alive again. Just some of the families who've been ripped apart since October 7th.
I love you, all the citizens of Israel who supported our families and our soldiers who did everything for us. Thank you very much. I love you.
Heartfelt reunions in Israel and the Palestinian territories. But beyond the numbers and the stark asymmetry of the two prisoner swaps, this ceasefire is far from guaranteed, with negotiations for what's called Stage 2 of the deal due to start this week.
Honestly, Hamas's best bet is to probably surrender and leave Palestine. I see no other way. The USA will not stop his bloodthirst. Yeah, no, famously, it was always Hamas, except it wasn't, right? Hamas is but an idea, all but a name. It's nothing. Hamas is simply the newest version of militant resistance against the Israeli apartheid. That's it. It's going to be called something else. When you orphan 40,000 children in the Gaza Strip, it's going to be called Hamas too. Do you understand? It's going to be called something else. There's always going to be an understandable need for emancipation. This is the most human thing. That's it. So as long as Israeli sovereignty reigns over the Palestinians, there will always be some kind of resistance. It doesn't have to be called Hamas, and it has taken many different forms throughout Israeli history in its 76 years of occupation. It's taken secular forms, Marxist forms. It's taken Islamist forms in its last iteration that still maintains a coalition alongside all other varying degrees of political ideology. That's it. And this is something that I think a lot of Israeli generals, including even Rear Admiral Dumbo Hagari, understands and has talked about. When Israeli generals say there is no military solution to Hamas, that is precisely what they mean. And he can hear me. Even though I'm in Japan, he can hear me all the way from Israel right now. Maybe he's heard me when I've talked about these things, and that's why he also has communicated this reality. When Israeli generals like war criminal Yoav Gallant, the former defense minister, says there is no permanent military solution to eradicating Hamas, we cannot solve this problem through military action, this is what they mean. What they actually mean is that unless you kill every single Palestinian, and even then, there's still going to be, a lot of people that live in diaspora. Like, there's always going to be a need for emancipation. People are always going to say, no, what the hell? I don't want to live under your rulership. This is insane. This is completely unacceptable. You're killing my family. You've destroyed my home. You've destroyed the mosque I go to. You destroyed the church I go to. You destroyed the school I went to. You killed my teacher. You killed my cousin. You killed my uncle. You killed my mother. You tortured my family. Ironically enough, the actual solution to ending this unnecessary bloodshed comes from, once again, pressuring the state that is responsible for the bloodshed and the violence continuing. It's making sure that Israel actually meets the standards of international law. That would go a incredibly long way of curbing back most of this violence. And the only way that can be done is if the American government decides, all right, our designs for the Middle East have changed. And through this war of attrition, we have recognized that it's probably better that we abide by the standards that we are supposed to abide by under international law. And we are forcing Israel's hand to, carve out a real humanitarian solution here.